It's 6 o'clock on Thursday, the 5th of May. Good morning. This is Today with Sean Farrington in Salford, Justin Webb in London.
The headlines this morning: explosions have been heard in cities across Ukraine a day after the country was accused by Russia of trying to assassinate President Putin. The UN has called for urgent talks with the rival generals in Sudan to try to secure safe passage for humanitarian aid. We'll be hearing from the UN's aid chief, Martin Griffiths, at 8:10. Also in today's programme, as drug companies claim significant advances in Alzheimer's treatment, could the current generation be the last to face the disease without effective drug therapies? And the MOD's complaint system continues to be ineffective and unfair. That's according to the Armed Forces Ombudsman.
Timeliness is still not where we would like it to be. It's still taking too long to resolve complaints. But I think the biggest overarching issue is still that sometimes within the service complaints process, we forget that there are people involved.
And
this is a Missy Elliott one-time exclusive.
with the rapper Missy Elliott set to be inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, why are female artists still so underrepresented there? The BBC News Today is read by Jane Steele.
Explosions have been heard overnight in Ukrainian cities, including Kiev. Air raid alerts have sounded across much of the east of the country. Zaporizhia and the Black Sea port of Odessa are both reported to have been targets. Officials say air defence systems are working. Yesterday, Moscow accused Ukraine of trying to assassinate President Putin in drone attacks on the Kremlin. Kiev denies the claims. Steph Twitty, a retired US Lieutenant General and former Deputy Commander of US European Command, says the latest attacks on Ukraine could be part of a broader tactical plan.
Russia started last week upping their missile attacks on Kyiv itself. And I think as they continue to do this, this is the Russians trying to throw or distract the Ukrainians from their counteroffensive, put their mind somewhere else, have them have to do other things.
The United Nations humanitarian chief Martin Griffiths says he has asked Sudan's rival military leaders to meet him face-to-face to discuss urgent protections for the delivery of aid. The conflict has led to shortages of essentials, including food and fuel. The UN says 6 of its World Food Programme lorries were looted on the way to Darfur, despite security assurances. Mr Griffiths was speaking to our chief international correspondent Lise Doucette after a visit to Port Sudan.
Mr Griffiths was visibly shaken by what he'd seen and heard. He spoke of unparalleled atrocities, a tragedy of global significance. During his visit to Port Sudan, he telephoned the warring leaders, General Burhan and his former deputy, General Dagalo. He asked them to give specific public assurances, including the protection of roads and airlifts, to allow urgently needed aid to be delivered. He said both men spoke eloquently of their attachment to humanitarian principles, but he admitted there still didn't seem to be the will to end this war.
4 former employees of Police Scotland say women are scared to speak up about harassment and bullying within its ranks. The women have told BBC Newsnight that a boys' club culture exists at all levels of the UK's second largest police force. More details from Kirsty Walk.
The 3 former officers and 1 member of civilian police staff all claim levels of misogyny have worsened since Police Scotland was formed in 2013, when 8 existing regional forces were merged. The women describe feeling ostracised after they made complaints about male colleagues. They say their mental health suffered badly as a result of their deciding to take action. 2 of them face legal costs that say left them almost destitute. Police Scotland told the BBC it was not immune from the sexism and misogyny which persists across society, but it said it was tackling the challenge head-on and said officers and staff felt clear progress had been made.
The UK's competition watchdog is beginning a review of the artificial intelligence market. It will analyse the technology behind popular chatbots such as ChatGPT and assess their impact on consumers. Here's our business correspondent Vijala Sripathma.
The Competition and Markets Authority will look at the type of role artificial intelligence is playing in businesses with the aim of assessing whether or not it provides an unfair advantage to those companies that are able to afford the technology. The CMA's chief executive, Sarah Cardell, told the Financial Times that it would examine so-called foundation models, such as the software underlying the AI assistant app ChatGPT. Ms. Cardell said it would be a fact-finding mission that would engage a range of experts in an attempt to find out how best to protect consumers.
Voting is due to begin in an hour's time in local elections across large parts of England. The last time most of these council seats were contested was in 2019, when Theresa May was Prime Minister. For the first time in England, voters will need to show a valid photo ID before casting their ballot. Here's our political correspondent Ben Wright.
While some key parts of the UK are not voting, including London, Birmingham, Wales and Scotland, around 8,000 council seats are up for grabs. Anyone voting today will have to take their photo ID with them. Passports, driving licences, older or disabled persons' bus passes and voter authority certificates are among the forms of identification that will be accepted at polling stations. Results from more than 60 councils in England are expected to be announced overnight, with the rest throughout the day tomorrow.
The singer-songwriter Linda Lewis has died at the age of 72. She performed at the first Glastonbury Festival in 1970 and had 4 top 40 hits, including It's in His Kiss, which reached number 6 in 1975. Linda Lewis also provided backing vocals for some of the biggest names in music, including Cat Stevens, Sir Rod Stewart and David Bowie.
6 minutes past 6 is the time. Let us have our first look at the weather. It comes this morning from Simon King at the BBC Weather Centre. Morning, Simon.
Good morning, Justin. We've got some fine weather again for many parts of the UK, but there will be some showers moving their way into the southwest. This is a sign of things turning more unsettled over the next couple of days. And of course, with the coronation weekend coming up, it does mean there are some showers or longer spells of rain in the forecast. So if you've got anything planned, I would definitely recommend staying tuned to the forecast. So let's start off with those showers. It's in southwest England and Wales that we'll gradually see the showers moving in through today and into this afternoon. Some of those could be heavy, maybe even thundery, and maximum temperatures getting up to about 14 to 16 degrees. But for southeast England, the Midlands, eastern and northern England, plenty of fine weather today with, again, some sunny spells, a bit more cloud building up into the afternoon. Temperatures getting up to about 16 to 19, perhaps 20 degrees, but around these eastern coasts of England, again, with a rather brisk east or southeasterly wind, it will feel chillier at about 9 or 10 Celsius. For Northern Ireland, western and southern Scotland, dry today really, with again some sunny spells, temperatures 14, 15 degrees Celsius. But for northern and eastern areas of Scotland, a bit of patch of rain across northern Scotland this morning. That's going to spread northward into the Northern Isles. It will stay fairly cloudy across these eastern areas into the afternoon. And again, with that breeze coming in off the North Sea, you'll notice that chill with temperatures about 9 or 10 Celsius.
Cheers, Simon. Let's have a look at this morning's papers. What's on the news websites? Plenty of pageantry, Justin, this morning. Let's have a look at preparations for the coronation feature on a number of front pages. The Daily Mail says the events will be surrounded by a royal ring of steel in the biggest policing operation in UK history. The paper says the Met will deploy vans with roof-mounted cameras and facial recognition technology, which can analyse thousands of people every minute and recognise, as the paper puts it, terror suspects, wanted criminals and known troublemakers.
Yeah, it's not just about the pageantry, is it, on the front pages? Because the human rights organisation Liberty has told The Guardian that the use of that live facial recognition technology at the coronation is, they say, extremely worrying. The group says the technology is a dystopian tool and dilutes all of our rights and liberties.
The Mirror highlights the Metropolitan Police's message that any demonstrators intent on obstructing the coronation can expect very swift action. A warning about police powers under the new Public Order Act has been sent to the anti-monarchy group Republic, whose president Graham Smith described the letter as intimidatory. He expects about 1,700 protesters to gather in Trafalgar Square on Saturday.
And according to the Telegraph, Republican supporters will be permitted to line the route of the royal procession, holding banners that denounce the King. Officers have been advised to engage with protesters rather than trying to remove them.
And under the headline, King healing wounds between Britain and Europe after Brexit, the newspaper says the government and Buckingham Palace hope that a royal visit to France, postponed in March because of protest over pension reforms there, can be rearranged soon. A friend of the monarch tells the paper that his visit to Germany showed he was a huge asset for British soft power.
The Guardian highlights reports from academics at Durham and Cambridge universities who found some of Britain's most elite schools benefiting from the slave trade. Eton College, Christ's Hospital School, Liverpool Bluecoats, among 29 schools said to have received substantial donations from people who profited from slavery in the 18th and 19th century.
The Times says NATO believes that Russia has planted explosives on critical European undersea infrastructure. The paper says the assessment is based on information from intelligence services and private companies that run key oil and gas pipelines, electricity connectors and telecoms cables.
Finally, the Express welcomes the promising results of a trial of a new drug for Alzheimer's. Writing the paper, Dr. Richard Oakley from the Alzheimer's Society says the success of the medicine, donanemab, means we are at the beginning of the end of the disease, and that's something we're going to be returning to at 7:30 this morning. Time now, 6:10. Serbia is going to hold 3 days of national mourning after the killing of 8 pupils and a guard by a 13-year-old boy. Bethany Bell is the BBC's correspondent, and plainly the entire nation, Bethany, coming together and horrified by what has happened. Is there any more detail about motive and about what happens now to this 13-year-old?
The police, the authorities have not spoken yet about motive. What they have said is that this attack appears to have been planned in advance, at least a month in advance. The suspect is alleged to have used his father's guns, both of which had legal permits. He's also said to have gone to a shooting range more than once with his father before those killings. The boy's parents have been arrested. And yesterday, in a televised address to the country, Serbia's president said that the suspect would be sent to a psychiatric clinic because under Serbian law, he's 13 years old and he can't be held criminally responsible as he's under 14.
And 3 days of national mourning and a nation, I mean, it's a relatively small nation, is it? The entire nation affected?
This is something that there's a real deep sense of shock here. I was at the school last night. It's in an area of Belgrade which is normally extremely lively, and the people who live there say it had never felt so quiet. People were coming there to lay flowers, to light candles for the victims of the attack. A real sense of shock that, mass shootings of this kind are very rare here, and that it should happen at a school which is a state school in Belgrade, in the centre of Belgrade, a very elite school, and it's one where people just could not have imagined, they said, that something like this could have happened there.
Bethany Bell in Belgrade, thank you.
Explosions have been heard across Ukraine this morning, including the capital, Kyiv. They come after the country's president, Volodymyr Zelensky, denied his country carried out an alleged drone attack on the Kremlin in Moscow yesterday. Hugo Bechega is our correspondent in Kyiv. Hugo, morning. What more can you tell us about these strikes overnight?
Morning, Sean. So it was the fourth night of attacks on Kyiv in a weekend here in the capital. The air raid alert sounded at around 2:30 in the morning and was lifted only 3.5 hours later. And the authorities here have described it as a comprehensive airstrike with missiles and drones. There were no reports of casualties. The authorities are saying that all drones that had been fired at Kyiv were intercepted by the country's air defense. And we had an update from the Ukrainian military which said that Russia had fired up to 24 drones at the country, but that 18 were intercepted by air defense. So I think, again, we're seeing how important the air defense systems have been here in Ukraine in protecting cities and towns across the country from these Russian airstrikes.
And Hugo, what more do we know about what occurred yesterday afternoon in Moscow?
Well, I don't think we've learned anything new, really. Again, such an extraordinary claim by Moscow and really no evidence to support the claim that Ukraine was behind this apparent drone attack that Moscow is describing as an attempt to assassinate President Putin. So I think many questions remain. Was it really Ukraine that was behind this apparent attack? Could this have been the work of some anti-Russia, pro-Ukraine group operating inside Russia, or indeed could it have been a false flag operation? In other words, something that was orchestrated and carried out by Russian officials. And I think this is the message that the Ukrainian authorities have been sharing here, that A, they've got nothing to do with it, and B, that this is something that Russia had done. And I think yesterday here in Kyiv, one of the president's top advisors said that Ukraine had nothing to do with this attack, that Kyiv had nothing to gain on the battlefield with a possible attack on the Kremlin. And he said that Moscow was actually trying to use this allegation, could be trying to use this claim to justify a large-scale attack on Ukraine. But I think the timing of this claim is obviously very significant, because the Ukrainians are saying that they are finishing their plans for this much anticipated counteroffensive to try to take back territory that's now under occupation.
Hugo, thank you. Hugo Bechega in Kyiv for us. We're going to be speaking to our Russia editor, Steve Rosenberg, before 7 o'clock.
16 minutes past 6 is the time now. Interest rates have gone up in the UK, as we know. They were raised last night in the US as well. What, though, is the Eurozone going to do? The same, perhaps. Felicity Hanna is in Salford with more on that. The rest of today's Business News. Morning, Fliss.
Morning. Yes, the European Central Bank, the ECB, will today face, the same question as other central banks as it decides whether to hold or raise interest rates in the Eurozone to try and tame inflation. There was a spanner in the works this week when the currency bloc reported inflation had ticked up last month, bucking the trend of a deceleration in prices. Let's talk to Catherine Nice, Chief European Economist for PGIM Fixed Income. And Catherine, before you were there, you held a number of roles at the Bank of England, so lots to ask you this morning. Good morning.
Good morning.
What are you predicting then that the ECB is going to do?
I expect the ECB also to raise interest rates at today's meeting. Inflation is just too high for the central bank there, but I do expect them to step down the pace at which they're raising the interest rate to a 25 basis point increment rather than the 50, 75 basis point increments we've seen in recent months. And that means that interest rates there could go from 3 to 3.25%. I think they're worried they don't want to overdo it.
Now, a lot of us have been surprised by inflation numbers coming out of various countries, but inflation in the Eurozone, how much is that going to be playing on their minds?
For sure, it's going to be a factor that feeds into their decision. As you mentioned before, we had seen signs that inflation was falling back in the Eurozone. In the US, we've seen that more consistent trend really going back some ways into last year. But if we take out what's happening with food and energy, because that's so distorted here in Europe from Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and we focus on the core bit of inflation, there the trends are really quite different between the US and the euro area, with the US showing a much more consistent decline in this core level of inflation, whereas in Europe we've seen it's just continued to be on a steady upward march. So that different picture means that, in my view, the ECB is going to be, a bit more forceful in terms of its language to back up this latest interest rate rise compared to, for example, what we saw coming out of the US yesterday.
So that's how the EU, the Eurozone compares to the States then. How does it compare? How does the situation compare to the UK when thinking about using interest rates to try and curb inflation?
It's really very challenging for all central banks, but I think the challenge is magnified here in the UK. And the reason for that really is if we step back and think about what are the key drivers of inflation, in the US, it's number one coming from that very strong economy, super tight labor market that's pushing up on inflation in the US. In Europe, the story is different. The primary driver is really coming from those energy prices that surged in the run-up and on the back of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. But of course, here what's happening in the UK is we're experiencing a bit of both of those. We have both a tight labor market and, of course, we're facing those very high energy prices in Europe. And so that's really just a double whammy hit, if you like, challenge facing the Bank of England here in the UK.
So very briefly then, given that double whammy hit, what are you expecting to see come out of the Bank of England next week when it makes its decision on interest rates?
Based on what we know today, I would expect them to also continue to raise interest rates like we saw coming out of the US yesterday, like I'm expecting today for the European Central Bank. And because as we've been discussing, inflation remains uncomfortably high. But that said, I'm expecting these central banks to be pretty close to peak interest rate. That is, that they will pause then for a time to see how the real economy is digesting all of these very rapid rises in interest rates before deciding on their next move.
Catherine Nice from PGIM Asset Management Company, thank you very much for joining us this morning. Let's stick with interest rates then. As we were discussing there, the Federal Reserve in the US has raised rates to the highest level in 16 years as part of its battle to stabilise prices. This is the Fed's 10th hike in 14 months, and the moves have pushed its benchmark rate to between 5% and 5.25%, and that is up from near zero in March 2022. Let's talk to Tineke Fricke, who's Senior Fund Manager at Waverton. Tineke, good morning.
Good morning.
What was your reaction then to that rate announcement?
Well, the rate announcement was bang in line with expectations. So we all seem to be doing a quarter of percentage point around the world. The main thing that everyone was sort of reading between the lines is what's next. So it seems to be suggesting, as expected, that it's a pause. So what we are all worrying about next is how long will it stay at these levels and what impact will that have? And obviously the impact on regional banks is continuing.
Let's talk about regional banks then, because shares in another US regional bank have plummeted by 50%. And this is just days after American regulators seized First Republic Bank and sold its assets to the investment giant JP Morgan Chase. PacWest is the latest mid-sized lender to seek help. What's going on here? Because JP Morgan's CEO, Jamie Dimon, said this phase of the banking crisis was over when that other deal was announced on Monday. Is he right?
Well, it depends how you define over. Certainly for shareholders in regional banks, it's not over because the shares keep plummeting. What he probably is right about is that they will not be allowed to fail, so they get bought. But nevertheless, confidence in these regional banks is really low. Shareholders are running for the exits and people are taking deposits out. So it will be a while before this stabilizes.